He heard them before he saw them. That's the thing Bernard Carabello told me, sitting across a conference table in a government building in Albany. 40-some years after the fact, his hands moving the way they always move. That particular tremor that cerebral palsy gave him when he was born. And that Willowbrook State School tried to convince the world meant he had nothing going on upstairs. He said, "I could hear the footsteps, and they were wrong. They hit the floor differently than the attendants. Too fast, too purposeful. Like people who had somewhere to be and knew it." Bernard was 20 years old in January of 1972. He had spent 17 of those years inside Willowbrook. He had never been tested. Not really. Not in any way that accounted for the fact that the only language he had been permitted to develop was the language of survival inside a locked ward. He could not read. He could barely feed himself without help. But that was Willowbrook's work, not his mind's limit. His mind had been absorbing everything for 17 years. The faces of the attendants who were kind and the ones who weren't. The schedule of the ward. Which days the sheets got changed, which days they didn't. The particular pitch of a scream that meant medical procedure versus the pitch that meant punishment. He knew that building the way you know your own body. And he knew, the moment those footsteps entered Ward B3, that something had changed. Then the light came on. A camera light, broad and white and electric, the kind that doesn't ask permission. It swept across the ward the way a lighthouse beam sweeps across water. Indifferent. Complete. Finding everything. Bernard said, "First time anyone pointed a light at us that wasn't a doctor. First time the light was for looking, not examining." The man holding the microphone was 28 years old. His hair was dark, and his mustache was dark, and he moved through the doorway with the specific energy of someone who knows he is walking into the most important moment of his career, and is also, genuinely, horrified by what he is seeing. His name was Geraldo Rivera, and he worked for WABC-TV in New York, and 6 days earlier he had received a phone call from a young physician named Dr. Michael Wilkins, who had been fired from Willowbrook for trying to organize the staff, who had driven to a payphone and called the one reporter he thought might actually come. Rivera came. He brought a camera operator and a sound technician, and they walked past the front entrance, which was locked, of course, and in through a side door that Dr. Wilkins knew about. A door that, on that particular January morning, happened not to be staffed. What Rivera found in Ward B3 was approximately 60 residents in a room built for perhaps 40. The smell hit before the visuals registered. Ammonia and something underneath it. Fecal. Biological. The smell of a body that has been left too long in one place. Concrete walls. No insulation. January in Staten Island means cold that comes up through the floor if the floor is concrete and the heat is unreliable, and the heat at Willowbrook was frequently unreliable. Some of the residents were clothed. Some were not. Some were sitting. Some were lying on cots without sheets. One man, who appeared to be in his 30s, was rocking with his knees pulled to his chest in a corner, making a sound low in his throat that Rivera later described as the most disturbing sound he had ever heard in his professional life, and Rivera had covered the Attica prison uprising. Bernard saw Rivera's camera find him. He did not look away. He held the frame. He would tell me, 4 decades later, that in that moment he made a decision. Not a slow decision, not a reasoned one, but the kind of decision that arrives whole. The kind your body makes before your brain catches up. He decided that whoever was carrying that camera was going to see him. All of him. Not the version of him that Willowbrook had made. The version that had been waiting 17 years for a light to come on. The footage aired on January 12th, 1972. 11 days later, on January 23rd, it aired again. This time as a 1-hour special called Willowbrook, The Last Disgrace. 20 million Americans watched it. The ABC switchboard received more calls than it had received for any broadcast in the network's history. But to understand what Rivera walked into, you have to go back. Not to the beginning. The beginning is too far, too slow, too much about architecture and appropriations budgets. You have to go back to a specific afternoon in September of 1947, when a woman named Dorothy Carabello, Bernard's mother, walked through the front entrance of Willowbrook State School for the first time, carrying her 3-year-old son, because she had been told by the Bureau of Child Guidance of New York City that this was a school, that her son would receive education and therapy and medical care, that this was the responsible thing to do. Dorothy Carabello was not a cold woman. She was a woman who had been given a diagnosis she didn't fully understand by doctors who spoke in clinical language designed to be reassuring while communicating nothing, and who had been guided by the city, by the state, by every official entity she encountered toward a single conclusion: that Willowbrook was the right place for a child like Bernard. The right place. The state of New York had opened Willowbrook in 1947 on Staten Island in a series of low brick buildings that had originally been constructed as an army hospital during the Second World War. The site was 375 acres. The buildings were functional in the bleak, utilitarian way of military construction: wide corridors, high ceilings, institutional green paint, the color of something that has lost the argument with itself. The original design capacity was 4,000 residents. By 1955, it held 5,400. By 1965, it held 6,200. By the time Bernard Carabello was an adult living inside it, Willowbrook was the largest state institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States, and it was operating at 155% of capacity, with a staff-to-resident ratio that, on some wards, ran to 1 attendant for every 60 residents on the overnight shift. 1 attendant, 60 people. A night that runs 12 hours. The state understood this. The numbers were in the budget reports. The budget reports went to the Department of Mental Hygiene. The Department of Mental Hygiene sent the reports to the governor's office. Nobody in the chain of that information found it urgent. Dorothy Carabello left Bernard at Willowbrook in September of 1947. The intake process took most of a morning. She signed forms. She was shown the ward, Building S6, the children's unit, which in 1947 was not yet severely overcrowded, which had beds with rails and a playroom with linoleum floors and a window that looked out onto the grounds. A staff member told her that Bernard would have structured activities every day. A staff member told her that physical therapy was available. She asked when she could visit, and the staff member said visiting days were Sundays, and she said she would come Sunday. She came the following Sunday. She came the Sunday after that. She came 11 Sundays. And then the Sundays became less frequent. And then Bernard was 4. And then 5. And then he was 8 years old, and she hadn't come in 2 years. And then she wrote a letter to the ward administrator asking for an update on his progress, and the ward administrator wrote back a letter with no specific information about Bernard at all, just a general statement about the therapeutic programming at Willowbrook. And Dorothy Carabello filed the letter and did not write again. This is not a story about a heartless mother. This is a story about what a system can do to the love between a parent and a child. How it can root that love through so much bureaucracy, so much clinical language, so much institutional architecture, that by the time the love tries to reach its destination, it has been processed into something unrecognizable. Dorothy Carabello had been told, at every turn, by every authority she trusted, that the responsible thing was to leave Bernard in the care of the state. The state had absorbed her son and given her nothing back but the silence of administrative reassurance. The guilt she carried is not something I can tell you about because she died in 1979 and left no record of it. What I can tell you is that Bernard did not see her for 11 years. And then she died. And he was told about her death at Willowbrook by an attendant, and he was not taken to the funeral. He was not taken to the funeral because Willowbrook residents did not leave Willowbrook. That was the logic of the institution. Once you were inside, the institution became your world, and the world outside became theoretical. Something that happened to other people, something that arrived occasionally in the form of visitors who came and then left again, confirming by their leaving that the world outside was real and accessible, and just not, for you, available. Bernard had cerebral palsy. He had spastic diplegia, which affects the lower limbs primarily and creates the tremor in his hands, the particular gait, the speech that takes slightly longer to arrive than most listeners expect. Cerebral palsy is a motor condition. It is not an intellectual condition. Bernard Carabello was not intellectually disabled. He had never been intellectually disabled, but the intake evaluation that placed him at Willowbrook in 1947 was conducted in 20 minutes by a physician who relied on observation rather than any standardized assessment, and the observation produced a classification of low-grade defective, a category that, in the language of 1947 institutional psychiatry, meant custodial care was the appropriate intervention. Custodial care? Not education, not therapy, not rehabilitation. Custody. The word is important. Custody means someone else decides where you go and when and for how long. Custody means your person belongs to an authority that is not you. Bernard Carabello entered Willowbrook under the authority of the state of New York when he was 3 years old, and for the next 17 years, every decision about his body and his time and his location was made by people who had filed the right paperwork. He was housed, over those years, in multiple wards as the population shifted and the buildings reorganized around their overcrowding. Ward after ward, building after building, S6 in the early years, then Building 9 when the children's units were consolidated, then a stretch in Building 11 that he doesn't talk about much, then B3, where Rivera found him. Each ward had its own logic, its own hierarchy among residents and among staff, its own version of the same smell. The smell didn't change between buildings. That was one way Bernard knew Willowbrook was all one place, even when it presented itself as many. He developed no formal reading skills because no one taught him to read. The educational programming that Dorothy Carabello had been promised existed largely on paper and ran, in practice, to perhaps 30 minutes of activity per day for residents who were classified as educable, which Bernard was not. He received no physical therapy after his first year because the physical therapy staff was drastically underfunded and prioritized residents with recent admissions. The staffing reports that the administration filed with the Department of Mental Hygiene in Albany listed a physical therapy department with 6 full-time positions. For most of Bernard's years at Willowbrook, 3 of those positions were vacant. The remaining 3 therapists served a population of over 6,000 people. The math did not work, and nobody was required to make it work. He spent long portions of his days in the day room, a large communal space, benches along the walls, linoleum floors that were mopped with a solution that smelled of industrial cleaner, sharp and medicinal on the days it was applied, underlaid the rest of the week by the longer, more permanent smell of the room itself. In later years, a television arrived, bolted to the wall on a metal bracket, turned to whatever channel the morning attendant chose and left there. The remote, if there was one, stayed at the nurse's station. The television was important. Bernard watched it for hours every day, year after year. He watched the news. He watched political coverage. He watched Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley deliver the events of a world he could not access, and he processed what he saw without anyone to discuss it with, without language to organize it, without any frame except the ward and the television, and the slow accretion of understanding that a mind will build for itself if you give it enough years and nothing else to work with. He told me once that watching the news at Willowbrook was like receiving transmissions from a planet you used to live on. You could understand the language. You recognized the landscape. You just couldn't get back there. He watched the Kennedy assassination. He watched it from the day room of Building 9, on the same bolted television, in a room of perhaps 40 people, most of whom did not fully understand what they were seeing. Bernard understood. He sat with that understanding by himself, and there was no one to tell. By the time he was 15, Bernard Carabello understood more about the outside world than the outside world knew about him. And the outside world, for the most part, was not asking. In September of 1965, Senator Robert Kennedy visited Willowbrook. The visit was not entirely voluntary. Kennedy was the junior senator from New York, newly elected, and a group of parents who had been trying for years to get anyone in Albany to pay attention to conditions inside the state institutions, had pressed his office repeatedly for a visit. Kennedy's staff arranged it through official channels, which meant the institution had advance notice, which meant certain wards were cleaned before his arrival. The staff-to-resident ratio on the day of the visit did not reflect the ratio on any ordinary Tuesday. The day room that Kennedy walked through had been arranged to look, if not comfortable, then at least organized. And still, what Kennedy saw was enough to make him stop in the middle of Ward C, Building 6, and stand very still. He was 40 years old. He had been inside prisons and poverty-stricken housing projects and civil rights holding cells. He had seen institutions. But something about the specific silence of Ward C, Building 6, on that September afternoon. The way sound seemed to disappear into the concrete. The way the residents moved or didn't move. The way the air itself seemed thick with something more than heat. Something stopped him. He turned to one of his aides. An aide named James Tolan was standing near the door, and Kennedy said to him, quietly, not for the press who were waiting outside, he said, "It's not fit for animals." Tolan later recalled that Kennedy stood there for perhaps 3 minutes without speaking again. That he looked at the room the way you look at something you're trying to memorize, or something you're trying to understand by looking hard enough. That when he finally turned toward the door, his jaw was set in a way that Tolan, who had worked for Kennedy through the 1964 campaign, associated with the senator being genuinely angry and choosing to convert the anger into something he could use later. The press got a version of it. What Kennedy said publicly, stepping out of Building 6 into the September light, was that Willowbrook was a snake pit. He said that New York state institutions were a blot on the conscience of the state. He said something had to change. A reporter from the Times asked him what specifically he intended to do. Kennedy said he would be pressing for an immediate review of appropriations for the state mental hygiene system. A reporter from Newsday asked whether he thought the institution should be closed. Kennedy said that was a question for the legislature and the governor. A reporter from the Post asked whether he intended to return. Kennedy said he hoped that wouldn't be necessary, because by the time he could return, things would have improved. They did not improve. And Kennedy did not return. The New York Times ran the story on page 1. The Daily News ran it. The AP wire carried it nationally. For 48 hours, Willowbrook was news. Parents called their state legislators. A few legislators made statements. The governor's office issued a response that acknowledged ongoing challenges in the state's mental health system and pledged to review appropriations. The review happened. Appropriations did not materially change. Kennedy moved on, to Vietnam, to civil rights legislation, to the 1968 presidential campaign that ended on a kitchen floor in Los Angeles. His death removed the one political figure who had actually stood inside Ward C, Building 6, and seen what was there. His absence did not matter to the institution because his presence had not materially changed it. The residents of Willowbrook woke up the next morning in the same wards. Bernard Carabello was 13 years old when Kennedy visited. He was not in Ward C, Building 6. He was in Building S10, on the other side of the grounds. He did not see Kennedy. He heard about the visit later, from an attendant who mentioned it in the way attendants sometimes mentioned the outside world. Briefly, as something that had happened somewhere else and was not directly relevant to the ward. Bernard processed it the way he processed everything. He filed it. He waited. The waiting was the condition. Waiting is what Willowbrook produced most reliably in its residents. Not healing, not growth, but a particular kind of suspension. The days were structured enough that you knew what was coming next, and unvaried enough that what was coming next was indistinguishable from what had already happened. Morning. Day room. Meals served in large metal containers carried by aides, the food uniformly beige and warm in the winter and lukewarm the rest of the time. The particular smell of institutional food, starch and overcooked vegetables and the ghost of something that was once meat, was so constant that Bernard has told me he smelled it for years after his release whenever he entered any large building, any cafeteria, any room where the ventilation was poor and the cooking happened in volume. That smell lives in the body longer than news coverage does. And while Bernard waited, and while Kennedy's statement dissolved into the next news cycle, and while the state's budget review produced no significant change, something else was happening inside Willowbrook. Something quieter. Something that most of the parents who trusted the institution with their children did not know about, because the consent forms had been written in language that required a particular kind of reading. The kind of reading that requires you to understand, in advance, that you are being asked to do something other than what you think you are being asked to do. The New York University Research Unit at Willowbrook had been operating since 1955. The unit was led by Dr. Saul Krugman, a pediatric infectious disease specialist of genuine distinction. Krugman had published important work on rheumatic fever. He was, by the standards of his field, a careful and rigorous scientist. He was also working at an institution where hepatitis was endemic, where it moved through the ward so routinely that new residents could reliably expect to contract it within 6 months of admission. The crowding made containment impossible. The sanitation made sanitation impossible. Children were living in close physical contact with other children in a facility that could not keep its surfaces clean because there were not enough staff to keep its surfaces clean. Hepatitis A spread through fecal-oral transmission. The wards at Willowbrook were, in the language of epidemiology, a perfect transmission environment. Krugman saw this. He saw it as a physician, which meant he saw a disease that was infecting children. He also saw it as a researcher, which meant he saw conditions that could be used to study that disease. To understand its transmission, its progression, its immune response, and potentially to develop a means of preventing it. The experiments began in 1956 and continued into the 1970s. The protocol was this. Newly admitted children who had not yet contracted hepatitis were separated into a research unit. They were fed hepatitis virus, extracted from the feces of infected residents, processed, given to children orally in the food, or in some cases via injection. They were monitored closely. Krugman and his team tracked the progression of the disease through each child's body with a specificity of observation that the ward staff could not provide for the general population, because the research unit had resources the ward did not. The children in the research unit received better food, more staff attention, more medical monitoring. The children in the research unit got sick on schedule and were watched while they got sick. And then they recovered, and their immune response was studied. The parents of children in the research unit signed consent forms. A woman I'll call Elizabeth Lee. This is a composite figure, built from the testimony of several parents who came forward during the legal proceedings of the 1970s and 1980s, and I want to be clear about that. Signed her consent form in 1963, when her daughter was 6 years old and had been at Willowbrook for 8 months. Elizabeth Lee had a high school education. She worked as a seamstress in a factory in Brooklyn. She had been told, when her daughter was admitted, that Willowbrook had a research program in infectious disease, and that participation was entirely voluntary. And she had said yes, she would participate. If it helped. If it helped anything. If there was any chance that something good could come from her daughter being in that place. The consent form that Elizabeth Lee signed was 3 pages. It used the word infection rather than deliberate infection. It used the phrase exposure conditions rather than we will feed your child a preparation containing the hepatitis virus. It stated that the research unit offered superior medical care and supervision, which was true. It did not state that admission to the general wards of Willowbrook was contingent on waiting lists, but that admission to the research unit had space available now, which was also true, and which meant that parents who wanted their children admitted quickly were, in practice, guided toward the research unit with a kind of gentle momentum that stopped well short of coercion, but also stopped well short of free choice. Elizabeth Lee signed the form on a Wednesday afternoon. She was given a pen by a research nurse who had a kind face and brown hair cut short at the chin. She signed on page 3, next to a line that had already been flagged with a small red arrow. The nurse thanked her. A physician she had never met before came in and shook her hand. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he told her, in words she would repeat years later to a journalist, that her daughter was going to be fine, that the research was important, that they were working on something that could protect children like her daughter from a disease that had killed thousands. He was not lying. That is the thing that has to be held alongside everything else. Dr. Saul Krugman was not a sadist. He was a scientist who had looked at hepatitis B, not the garden variety hepatitis A that spreads through contaminated food and water, but hepatitis B, which is transmitted through blood and bodily fluids, and which, in the mid-20th century, killed an estimated 1 million people per year worldwide, and had determined that the children of Willowbrook, who were going to get sick anyway, could also be the key to understanding how to stop it. His research produced the first reliable distinction between hepatitis A and hepatitis B as distinct viral entities. His work on immune response in children who had been exposed and recovered formed a foundational basis for what would, in 1981, become the world's first hepatitis B vaccine. That vaccine has since prevented an estimated 1.5 million deaths annually. The children in the research unit got sick on purpose, and the data from their illness is inside every dose of that vaccine. Both of those things are true at the same time. They have been true at the same time for 60 years. The medical ethics establishment has never fully resolved them. The World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki, revised in 1964, established principles for research on human subjects that Krugman's work challenged and arguably violated. You cannot use an institutionalized, captive population as a research subject pool if the conditions of their captivity influence their consent. You cannot offer superior care to research participants as an inducement if the alternative is the standard of care inside Willowbrook, because the standard of care inside Willowbrook was not a standard anyone should be making decisions against. Krugman published his findings in The Lancet, and in the Journal of the American Medical Association. His work was peer-reviewed and acclaimed. He received the Lasker Award in 1983, one of the highest honors in American medicine. He died in 1995, at 80 years old, having spent the last decades of his life aware that his research was ethically contested, and having never, in any public statement, agreed that what he had done was wrong. He believed, and this belief was not stupid, not callous. It was the product of a particular moral framework that many physicians of his generation shared. He believed that the greatest good was the greatest number saved. He believed that the children at Willowbrook were going to contract hepatitis regardless, and that their suffering, directed through a research protocol, could generate knowledge that would prevent suffering in millions of others. He also believed that the consent forms were adequate. Elizabeth Lee's daughter was in the research unit for 14 months. She contracted hepatitis B. She recovered. She was returned to the general population of Willowbrook, where she spent 12 more years. Elizabeth Lee visited her daughter 4 times during those 14 months in the research unit because the research unit had more flexible visiting hours, and then the visiting became less frequent again. And then Elizabeth Lee died in 1971 without having resolved, for herself, what she had consented to. She never knew about the hepatitis B vaccine. She never knew her daughter's immune response was in the data. She died knowing only that she had signed a form in a room where a nurse had a kind face, and that her daughter had gotten sick, and that a man with reading glasses on his forehead had shaken her hand. The year Elizabeth Lee died, Dr. Michael Wilkins arrived at Willowbrook as a newly hired physician. Wilkins was 26, a recent graduate of New York Medical College, idealistic in the specific way that medical idealism works. Not naive, exactly, but still operating on the assumption that the institutions of medicine were fundamentally in the business of making people better. He lasted 4 months before he began writing internal memos to the administration about conditions in the wards. He lasted 6 months before he began organizing with other staff members. He lasted 8 months before he was fired, in October of 1971, for what the administration termed insubordination and disruption of institutional operations. He drove to a payphone. He called Geraldo Rivera. They talked for 40 minutes. Wilkins described the staffing ratios. He described the wards he had personally observed. He described Building 11, where on one winter night he had found a resident lying on the floor of a hallway for what the other residents indicated, through gesture, had been several hours, lying there, conscious, unable to get up, and no staff member had been in that corridor since the overnight shift began. He described the smell that lived inside the building, the way weather lives inside a house. He described, in the language of a young doctor, the cumulative medical consequences of what he had seen, the untreated infections, the dental problems, the contractures that develop in residents who spend too many hours in fixed positions, the skin conditions, the respiratory issues endemic in a building where dozens of bodies share air that moves too slowly through too small a space. Rivera listened. Then he called his producer. Then he called the station's legal department. Then he called Wilkins back and said, "I need a way in." Rivera had been at WABC for less than a year. He had come to journalism through an unlikely route: City College, Brooklyn Law School, the Young Lords, a community organizing group in East Harlem, for which he had done legal work and through which he had begun contributing reports to a local television station. He had a law degree and a camera, and a very short fuse for institutions that protected themselves at the expense of the people inside them. He was, in January of 1972, exactly the wrong person for Willowbrook to have looking at it. Or the right one, depending on whose side you were on. He listened to Wilkins on the phone for 40 minutes. Then he called his producer. Then he called the station's legal department. Then he called Wilkins back and asked for a way in. The side door that Wilkins knew about was in the eastern section of Building B. It was not a secret door. It was a service entrance that was supposed to be staffed, but was understaffed because Willowbrook was understaffed everywhere, because the state had allocated, for fiscal year 1972, approximately 65 cents per resident per day for food and programming. 65 cents. The institutional standard the American Association on Mental Deficiency had recommended was approximately $3.50. The difference between 65 cents and $3.50, multiplied by 6,200 residents, multiplied by 365 days, is the distance between what Willowbrook was and what it was supposed to be. Rivera and his crew entered Building B on the morning of January 12, 1972. They had about 45 minutes before anyone in administration noticed they were there. They used every minute. Rivera moved through the wards without a script. He was not composing narration in his head. He told me, years later, that narration was the furthest thing from his mind, that what happened in those wards shut his journalist brain off entirely for the first few minutes, that he was just a person standing in a place that a person should not be able to stand in a country that called itself civilized. He said, "I kept thinking, this is legal. This is funded. This is the state of New York on a Thursday morning." And I couldn't make it make sense. His camera operator, Steve Beyer, kept filming. Beyer had shot riots and fires and courtroom testimony. He kept his hand steady. The footage he captured that morning, 44 minutes of it, which would be edited to segments totaling about 17 minutes for broadcast, is now in the archive of the Disability History Museum. If you can find it, watch it without sound first. Watch the way the bodies in those rooms relate to the space. Watch the distance between people that is not distance at all. Watch where the light falls and what it finds. Bernard Carabello was in his corner of Ward B3 when Rivera came in. He was sitting on a bench. He had been sitting on that bench, or one like it, for more hours than he could count. He watched the camera light sweep the room. He watched Rivera's face, the way Rivera's jaw tightened, the way his eyes went wide and then deliberately narrowed, the professional reflex of control over a reaction he was not going to show on camera, because showing it would make the story about him. Rivera's microphone came on. He began to speak. To the camera, to whoever was watching, to the future. He began to describe what he was seeing in the flat, declarative language of someone who has decided that the most powerful thing he can do is simply say what is in front of him. He said, "The residents of Ward B3 are living in conditions that I'm going to let you see for yourselves." He said, "The temperature in this room is currently 46 degrees. He said, "There is no heat." Bernard held the frame. Then Rivera turned, and the camera turned, and Rivera walked toward Bernard, and something happened that Bernard has described to me in 3 separate conversations over the years, and described differently each time in the specific details, but identically in the essential fact. Rivera crouched down to Bernard's level, and he asked Bernard what his name was. Nobody in 17 years had crouched down to Bernard's level to ask him anything. Bernard told him his name. Rivera said, "How long have you been here, Bernard?" Bernard held up his fingers. He tried to say 17 years, and what came out was halting, was shaped wrong by the cerebral palsy, was words that took a moment to become audible. And Rivera waited. Rivera did not finish the sentence. He waited. And Bernard said, in his own time, in his own voice, 17 years. Rivera said, "Do you want to leave?" The floor of Ward B3 was cold concrete. The wall behind Bernard was painted institutional green, the paint applied over itself so many times in so many years that the surface had gone slightly uneven, slightly geological, the way surfaces do when they've been painted over, rather than repaired. There was a smell in the room. Layered. Organic. The smell of a room that is cleaned inadequately and inhabited continuously. The smell that gets into fabric and concrete and paint and does not leave even when the room is empty. Rivera could smell it. His sound technician, standing near the door, had put one hand briefly over his nose when they first entered. He had lowered it after a moment because of what it would look like. Bernard held Rivera's gaze. He said, "Yes, that footage aired at 6 o'clock that evening. WABC promoted it in the news break at 5:45, a 10-second clip of Rivera walking through the ward with a voiceover that said, 'Tonight on Eyewitness News, a state school on Staten Island. What we found inside.' The clip was enough." Phones began ringing at the station before the 6 o'clock broadcast ended. Parents called, former employees called, at least 3 state legislators called. A woman in Queens called and said, "I put my son there in 1959. I stopped visiting in 1962. Please, please, find him and tell me he's alive." He was alive. He was 47 years old by the time anyone went looking. And he had spent 46 of those years inside Willowbrook. And he was alive. The broadcast on January 12th was Rivera's first report. He was back on January 16th with follow-up footage and interviews with former staff members. He filed reports on January 19th and January 22nd. On January 23rd, ABC aired the full 1-hour documentary, Willowbrook, The Last Disgrace. The broadcast was anchored by Rivera, with reporting that included footage from the wards, interviews with Wilkins and 2 other former staff members, a sit-down with parents who had no idea their children were living in the conditions shown, and, crucially, a brief, on-camera interview with Bernard Carabello. Bernard sat in front of Rivera's camera, and in his own time, with his own voice, told a television audience of 20 million people that he had been at Willowbrook since he was 3, that he had not chosen to be there, that he was not what they had told people he was, that he wanted to leave. The control room at WABC could hear, through the headsets, the phone lines beginning to ring before the interview was finished. What followed the broadcast is often described as a tidal wave of public reaction, which is the kind of language that makes it sound passive, natural, inevitable, as if the public simply surged in response to information. It was not passive. The parents whose children were at Willowbrook had been calling Albany for years. The advocacy organizations for people with disabilities had been writing letters and filing complaints and requesting legislative hearings for years. The staff members who had witnessed conditions inside the institution had been reporting those conditions to supervisors and, in some cases, to state inspectors for years. The information was not new. What was new was that 20 million people had seen it, at the same time, on their televisions. And the mechanism by which information becomes political pressure is not volume, it is simultaneity. It is the moment when enough people know the same thing at the same time that institutions can no longer pretend the knowledge is marginal. Governor Nelson Rockefeller issued a statement 2 days after the documentary aired. He was not, at this point, surprised by the conditions at Willowbrook. His own budget office had reports on the institution's population and staffing ratios. He was, however, surprised by the specificity of the public's knowledge and by the nature of the demand that was emerging from that knowledge. Not just improve conditions, but change the system. Not just give the institution more money, but ask whether the institution should exist at all. That question, should it exist at all, was the one that nobody in the state government had been willing to ask, because the alternative to the institution was a system of community-based care that did not yet exist, that would cost money to build, that would require political will that nobody in the governor's office had developed any interest in spending. The New York Civil Liberties Union and New York Legal Services filed suit on behalf of Willowbrook residents on March 17, 1972. The case was Willowbrook versus Rockefeller, later retitled New York State Association for Retarded Children versus Rockefeller. The lead attorneys were Bruce Ennis and John Gray. The plaintiff class was every resident of Willowbrook, thousands of names attached to a legal action that sought not merely improved conditions, but a constitutional right to treatment, the right to live in the least restrictive environment possible, the right to not be warehoused. Bernard Carabello was not immediately part of that legal action, because Bernard Carabello was not immediately free. His departure from Willowbrook did not happen on the night the documentary aired, despite what a cleaner version of this story might suggest. He left Willowbrook in April of 1972, 3 months after Rivera's camera found him, through a process that required Rivera's producer to make phone calls, that required Wilkins to provide documentation, that required a guardian to be designated, that required the institution to sign off on a release, that the institution's administration did not particularly want to sign off on, because releasing Bernard was, in a small way, an admission that he should not have been there. He left through a side door, a different side door than the one Rivera had entered, on an April morning when the grounds were wet, and the air smelled like mud and new grass, and he told me he stood outside on the sidewalk for 2 full minutes before he got into the car that was waiting for him, because he had not stood on a sidewalk since he was 3 years old, and he needed a moment to understand what it felt like. It felt, he said, like the ground was temporary, like it might not hold. The legal case moved through the federal courts with the speed of institutional reform, which is to say, slowly, incrementally, with the resistance of a system arguing against the conditions of its own existence. The attorneys for the state of New York argued that conditions at Willowbrook were the product of underfunding, not of rights violations, that the state had a duty to provide care, which it was providing, and that the constitutional question of what kind of care was not one the courts should answer. Federal Judge Judd Orrin Rothwax, to whom the case was initially assigned, disagreed. His successor, Judge John Bartels, inherited a case that had grown into something with no clean legal precedent. In 1975, the parties signed a consent decree. Not a court victory, but a negotiated agreement. The consent decree established that Willowbrook residents had a constitutional right to protection from harm, to individualized treatment plans, to conditions of living that respected their dignity, and to placement in community settings whenever possible. It established a review panel with actual authority to monitor compliance. It established timelines. It did not close Willowbrook. The consent decree mandated a reduction in the population. The institution that held 6,200 people in 1972 was required to reduce its population to 250 by 1981. The reduction happened, slowly, against resistance at every administrative level, through the creation of community residences and group homes, and supported living arrangements that advocates had to fight for, one by one, in neighborhoods that frequently did not want them. The phrase, "not in my backyard," became political language in New York during this period in the context of group homes for people with developmental disabilities. Community boards filed objections. Neighbors organized. Houses where group homes opened had their windows broken. Local officials called press conferences about community character and property values and the need for adequate supervision, which was the language that substituted, in polite company, for what was actually being said, which was, not here, not near us, not these people. A group home proposed for a street in Queens in 1977 received 47 written objections from neighbors before it opened. The home opened anyway because the consent decree required it to, and because the attorneys from New York Legal Services were willing to go back to Judge Bartels every time a municipality tried to block a placement. The people who had been residents of Willowbrook moved into these group homes and, in most cases, did not break any windows. They went to grocery stores and learned to use public transit and attended community programs, and in some cases got jobs, which should not have been surprising but was, to people who had been told all their lives that people like the residents of Willowbrook could not do these things. One man who had spent 31 years at Willowbrook, released in 1978, got a part-time job at a dry cleaner's in the Bronx. He held that job for 11 years. His supervisor described him years later to a reporter as the most reliable employee he had ever had. Bernard Carabello got a job. He began working as an advocate, first informally, then formally, with organizations that were fighting for the rights of people with disabilities. He testified in legislative hearings. He went back to school. He learned to read, at 24 years old, in a program designed for adults who had been denied education. He became, over the following decade, one of the most prominent self-advocates in the disability rights movement in the United States. Willowbrook did not close until September 17, 1987. 15 years after Rivera walked through the door with his camera. 13 years after the consent decree. The last residents were moved out in a process that took most of a year, into community placements that the state had been slowly, inadequately, building since 1975. The institution that had held 6,200 people closed with 83 residents remaining. 83 people for whom the system had not yet found, or adequately funded, a place in the world outside. The closing was not celebrated publicly in any significant way. There was no ceremony. There was no event. The gates closed, and then the building stood empty. And then, over the following years, the buildings were converted. Today, the site is the College of Staten Island. 17 of the original Willowbrook buildings remain on the campus, retrofitted for academic use. Classrooms, administrative offices, a gymnasium. The campus covers the same 375 acres. Students study nursing and education and business and the liberal arts on grounds where, for 40 years, the state of New York conducted the largest single experiment in institutional failure in American history. There is a memorial. It is a small plaque mounted on a stone near the campus entrance. It says that this site was formerly Willowbrook State School. It says that a documentary expose in 1972 led to reforms in the care of people with developmental disabilities. It says that the school closed in 1987. The plaque is roughly 18 inches by 24 inches. Students walk past it every day on their way to class. I stood at that plaque on a Tuesday morning in October, which means the campus was full. Students with backpacks moving between buildings, someone playing music from a speaker near the library entrance, the ordinary ambient sound of an educational institution going about its business. The air smelled like cut grass and, faintly, like the interior of old buildings. That particular smell of concrete that has absorbed decades of human presence. I stood there for a while. A student walked past while looking at her phone. Another one glanced at the plaque and kept moving. The New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities now oversees a network of state-operated and voluntary provider group homes across the state. The network has been under scrutiny repeatedly in recent years for staffing shortages, for incidents of abuse that went unreported, for a culture of institutional self-protection that investigators have found in multiple homes. A 2019 report by the New York Times found that the state had shielded employees accused of abusing group home residents from criminal prosecution for years. The report used language like systemic failure. It ran on page 1. The response from the governor's office acknowledged ongoing challenges. The language has not changed. Geraldo Rivera went on from Willowbrook to a long career in television journalism, which passed through moments of genuine importance. His reporting on drug addiction in the 1970s, his advocacy work on behalf of people with disabilities in multiple subsequent broadcasts, and through moments of something considerably less than that. The Al Capone Vault, the daytime talk format that bore his name. He has said, in multiple interviews over the years, that the Willowbrook exposé was the most important work he ever did. He has also, at various points, made choices that subordinated that work to his own visibility in ways that the people who lived inside Willowbrook never had the option of doing. He built a career on a story that was not his to build a career on, and he has also never fully denied that. And both of those things are part of what he is. Bernard Carabello is 77 years old. He still speaks at conferences. I watched a video of him speaking at a disability rights symposium in Washington, D.C. in 2019, where he stood at a podium in a dark suit and spoke, in his own time, in his own voice, about Willowbrook, about the ward, about the camera light, about the moment Rivera crouched down and asked him his name. He said, "I was not what they said I was. I knew it then, and I know it now. And I want you to know something else." Most of them knew it too. The people who classified me. The people who signed the forms. They weren't all stupid. They weren't all evil. They had a system that told them what to do, and they did it. And the system kept going, and that is what we have to understand. The system kept going. The room was quiet. Someone near the back coughed. He said, "So now I come here, every year, to talk to people who will go back to their offices and write reports and recommendations and white papers. And I say this every time. The system is still going. It's smaller. It looks different. The buildings are different. But somewhere tonight there is a person in a room who is not what someone else says they are, and the system is keeping them there, and nobody has pointed a camera at them yet." He paused. He looked at the room for a moment. He said, "I'm still waiting for the footsteps. The campus of the College of Staten Island was built on ground that Willowbrook's residents walked on, slept on, bled on. The buildings that held them have been repainted and rewired and renamed. The classrooms where students now learn about ethics and medicine and public policy occupy the same square footage as the wards where Krugman's research team drew blood from children who had been fed a virus in their food. The gymnasium where students work out stands 50 yards from where. On certain nights when the heat failed and the staffing was thin and the ward was 92 people over capacity, nobody came. Bernard Carabello's cerebral palsy was diagnosed before he could speak. The diagnosis that placed him at Willowbrook was written by a physician he met once. The classification that governed the next 17 years of his life was produced in 20 minutes. The state that held him never, in those 17 years, questioned whether it had gotten him right. The plaque near the entrance does not say his name. It should.